said he as a prophet. They said he could see the end of the world before it came. But when the end finally arrived, it came for him first. In the spring air of northern Italy, the mountains stood cold and quiet. Below them, the smoke rose from the stakes, the smoke of his people. Men and women who had followed him into exile now burned one by one, their screams carried on the wind. And Fra Dolcino, bound in chains, flesh torn, breath shallow, watched every flame climb into the sky like a message from a god he thought he knew. It had begun with a promise that the church would fall, that the poor would inherit a new kingdom of the faithful. It had begun with hope. Now the hope was gone, replaced by the stench of blood and ash, and the sight of his last companion waiting for her own turn in the fire. This was not paradise. This was judgment. And to understand how a man could lead hundreds into the mountains, only to see them perish before his eyes, we must begin where the world around him was already cracking. It didn't start with fire. It started with hunger. Hunger in the fields. Hunger in the soul. Hunger that turned prayer into a bargaining chip and salvation into a debt collected at the church door. Northern Italy, early 14th century. Marble cities fat with coin, cathedrals rising like fortresses, chalices bright as new suns. Incense filled the naves, wine filled the cups. The vestments gleamed, and so did the rings. Outside those doors, the wind came in cold off the hills of Piedmont and Lombardy, and it carried the smell of wet earth, thin soup, and tired animals. Mothers bartered bread for mercy. Fathers counted coins twice, then again, because the tithe would not bend. Faith was supposed to be a ladder up to heaven. Instead, it felt like a weight tied to the ankle. In the cracks of that weight, another voice took shape. Men in coarse wool appeared, the apostolic brethren, saying the old words in a way that made them sound clean again. Poverty, chastity, the gospel, and nothing else. No silk, no gold, no fat tables. Walk like the apostles walked. Live as they lived. For the poor, it felt like water after dust. For bishops and abbots, it smelled like medieval heresy, tinder stacked at the base of a dry wall. Then tinder met flame. In the year 1300, Gerard Segarelli burned. The crowd watched the smoke writhe like a serpent above the square. Some wept, some prayed, some stared hard so they wouldn't forget. Rome called it justice. Yet the story that moved through the alleys after dark told something stranger, that the church could scorch a body and still fail to cauterize an idea. Meanwhile, the land itself fought over crowns and loyalties. Guelph and Ghibelline, town against town, lord against commune. And every quarrel left another bruise on the same old body. Taxes rose, soldiers marched, and harvests shrank. People wanted less rhetoric and more bread. They wanted a God who answered without sending an invoice. When the brethren were hunted, they didn't vanish. They retreated into memory, into song, into whispered prayer between husband and wife after the children slept. They traded news the way merchants traded wares, who had escaped, who had died, what the next winter might bring. There were stories of small miracles, of bread shared and bellies filled, of a sick child who woke without fever. There were darker stories too, of grain seized from church barns under cover of fog, of priests roughed in ditches, of mercy turning to rage when the cupboards were bare. Hope and resentment braided together until no one could tell which strand was which. That is where the ground softened. That is where the step of a new leader would land without a sound. A man listening more sharply than the rest. A man who looked at the ash that once was Segarelli and saw not an ending, but a map. The chain on the poor was still there. The gold on the altar was still bright. The wound was still open, and the body still bled. All it needed was someone to say the quiet part aloud, that the kingdom promised to the meek was not a rumor but a clock, and the hands were finally moving. Somewhere in the hills, somewhere in the markets, the name began to circulate softly, like a candle passed from one set of hands to another. Not yet a shout, not yet a sermon, just a breath in a cold room, gathering warmth, gathering witnesses, as the man who would claim the vision stepped out of the crowd and let the fire find him. They didn't find him in the churches. They found him on the road. A thin figure in worn wool, walking as if every mile was already mapped in his mind. He spoke not like a beggar, but like a man who had been waiting for the rest of the world to catch up to what he already knew. Dolcino's rise was not forged in one sermon or one act of defiance. It came in fragments, in the way he remembered every face that listened, in the way he spoke of Scripture without stumbling, in the way he could turn a verse into a mirror that made his listeners see their own lives reflected back at them. People swore his words were not just spoken, but delivered. And when he spoke of Rome's corruption, he did not whisper. He said the church had traded its soul for silver. He said God's kingdom was near, and it would not come quietly. In the markets of Vercelli and Novara, his voice carried like smoke, curling into alleys and kitchens. Fishermen stopped mending their nets. Merchants forgot the weight of their scales. It wasn't just what he promised. It was how he made the promise feel inevitable. The old world would fall. The poor would rise. Those who believed would not just be saved, they would inherit. But prophecy is a dangerous coin. One side buys devotion, the other buys enemies. Bishops called him a deceiver, lords called him a threat. And still, his followers multiplied. Farmers, widows, runaway apprentices, even a handful of priests who traded their robes for rough wool. They brought him bread, weapons, whispers of safe places in the hills. He called them brothers and sisters, and for a time it felt as if the line between leader and follower had vanished. Yet in that unity, a shadow moved. Because in promising the end of Rome, Dolcino had set a clock in motion, and clocks do not run without the sound of their own ticking. The louder his voice grew, the closer came the day when someone would try to silence it. It was in those restless months, with the air thick from both hope and danger, that Dolcino's path crossed with someone who would change not only his fate, but the very heartbeat of his cause. She did not come to him as a follower. She came to him as fire. Margherita, young, sharp-eyed, and fearless in a way that made even Dolcino pause. She had heard his words long before she ever saw his face, and when she finally stood before him, it was not with the reverence of a disciple, but the certainty of an equal. Her presence in his circle changed the air. Others spoke of faith. She spoke of destiny. She moved among the apostolic brethren with a conviction that did not need to be borrowed from Dolcino's sermons. If he was the voice, she was the echo that carried it farther than he could reach alone. It is hard to say where devotion ended and love began. In the camps outside the towns, they spoke together under the canvas of thin tents, the night wind rattling the stakes as if impatient to hear their plans. Some nights, the talk was strategy, where to gather supplies, which villages might shelter them, which roads to avoid. Other nights, it was only the quiet exchange of two people who believed they had been chosen for the same impossible task. But the more she stood beside him, the more she drew the eyes of their enemies. The bishops saw scandal in their bond, proof, or so they claimed, that Dolcino's holiness was a lie. The Lord saw her as a weakness, a tether that could be pulled to drag him down. Dolcino did not care. If anything, Margherita's presence made him harder, sharper. His sermons grew less like invitations and more like warnings. He no longer spoke of reform. He spoke of the fall and of what would be built in the ashes. She listened without flinching, and when he called the people to prepare for exile, she was already packing the few things they could carry. What began as a voice and an echo was about to become something else entirely. Not just a movement, but a fortress of flesh and faith, climbing into the mountains where the reach of Rome thinned. But the winds grew colder. They climbed not to escape, but to defy. When Dolcino led his people into the mountains, it was not a retreat. It was the planting of a flag in the one place Rome's hand could not easily reach. The slopes of the Alps became their walls. Sharp ridges and narrow passes guarded them better than any stone fortress could. Snow came early and stayed late, but in those first weeks, the cold felt like an ally. It kept their enemies at a distance, slowed the march of soldiers, muffled the world beyond. The apostolic brethren turned exile into order. They built huts from timber and stone, dug into the earth for cellars, stored what little grain they could gather. Men hunted in the forests. Women tended fires that burned through the night. Here, Dolcino was not just a preacher. He was a commander. Every task was a duty. Every hardship a test of the faithful. To survive here was to prove you were chosen. Yet the mountains demanded a price. Supplies from sympathetic villages were never enough. The long winter gnawed at the weakest first, the sick, the elderly, the children. Hunger crept into their camp like a shadow, and with it came the whisper that even the chosen could starve. Dolcino's sermons grew sharper, his voice cutting through the freezing air. He told them the suffering was a sign, that the time of tribulation was foretold. But beneath the conviction, the reality pressed closer. Snow could protect them from armies, but it could not be eaten. The same mountains that shielded them could also bury them. Still, no one turned back, not yet. The roads below were watched. The cities were hostile, and so they stayed, holding to the hope that spring would bring relief, not knowing that with the thaw would come something far worse than winter. The first sign of the siege was not the army, it was the silence. The trails that had once brought bread, salt, and whispered news from the valleys below went quiet. No traders, no allies. Only the wind and the faint echo of horns somewhere beyond the ridges. Then they saw them. Banners cresting the lower slopes, armored lines moving like slow water, swallowing the passes one by one. The bishops had spoken. The lords had answered. And now the mountains that had been Dolcino's shield were closing in like a trap. The siege began with patience. The soldiers did not rush. They ringed the high ground, sealing every path that led out. Food could not come in. The brethren could not go down. At first, Dolcino urged his followers to endure. He told them that God had tested prophets before, that famine was a crucible and the faithful would emerge pure. But winter does not wait for sermons to end. The snow deepened, the cold burned harder, and the grain cellars sank toward empty. By the second month, hunger was no longer a shadow, it was a predator. Children cried until they had no breath left. Mothers gave their rations to the sick, and the sick died anyway. Men went into the woods to hunt and came back with nothing but frost on their beards. The soldiers knew what they were doing. Every day they stayed in their ring. They killed without lifting a sword. Then came the public burnings. Captured followers were dragged to the lowest ridge, stakes driven into the snow. The fire crackled, the smoke rolled up the slope, and the screams carried all the way to Dolcino's camp. It was no accident. It was a message. One meant to break them before the steel ever touched flesh. But if the enemy thought fear would loosen Dolcino's grip, they were wrong. It did the opposite. His words grew darker, his eyes sharper. He told them they would not bow, they would not yield, and if the world wanted to starve them into dust, they would answer with fire of their own. Hunger changes the shape of a man's faith. It pares away the soft edges, leaves only the bone and the will to survive. By the time the snow began to melt, Dolcino's camp was no longer a congregation. It was an army. The sermons that once spoke of the kingdom of heaven now spoke of vengeance. Dolcino told his people the enemy's wealth was stolen, that every loaf of bread in a lord's storehouse was a crime waiting to be punished. And when the first raiding party left the mountain, armed with knives and desperation, no one tried to stop them. They struck villages that had turned their backs on the brethren. Granaries were broken open, livestock driven up the slopes. Some houses burned. Some men died defending them. The survivors told stories of heretics who fought with the ferocity of wolves cornered in their den. Each raid brought food, but it also brought blood. And blood has a way of staining more than the hands that spill it. The line between salvation and survival blurred, then vanished. Dolcino, once the shepherd, now moved like a general, planning strikes, setting traps, sending messages not with parchment, but with smoke and ash. But the more they fought, the more their enemies closed in. The siege ring tightened, reinforcements climbed the passes, and the lowlands were scoured for anyone who might feed the mountain stronghold. The church's patience had not run out. It had simply been waiting for the right moment to crush them in a single blow. Spring should have brought relief. Instead, it brought the final noose. The mountain broke before the man did. When the snow finally pulled back, the enemy was already there, climbing from every side, armor flashing in the pale sun. The siege was no longer a ring. It was a fist, closing. Dolcino had no more roads to send raiders down. The valleys were sealed. The forests were patrolled. Every source of food and firewood was in enemy hands. Those still alive in the camp were shadows of themselves, faces hollow, clothes hanging loose, eyes fixed on the horizon, as if willing some miracle to crest the ridge. It did not come. What came instead was betrayal. A handful of his followers slipped away under the cover of fog, some carrying word to the soldiers below in exchange for their own lives. Others stayed only because there was nowhere left to go. Dolcino's sermons, once fire, now burned low and cold, measured words for people who no longer needed to be inspired, only told where to stand when the attack began. When the final assault came, it was sudden. Trumpets split the thin air. Shields and spears clattered against stone. The narrow passes that had protected them became killing grounds, and those too weak to fight were trampled or cut down where they stood. Dolcino fought among them, not from a pulpit, but with a blade in hand, striking at men who swore they carried God's justice in their swords. But even mountains can be conquered. By nightfall, the stronghold was gone, its huts in flames, its defenders dead or bound in rope. Dolcino and Margherita were taken alive, dragged down from the peaks that had once been their sanctuary, now only the high place from which their fall had been seen by all. Chains have a way of making the world feel smaller. The moment the ropes bit into his wrists, Dolcino's mountains were gone. The wind, the sky, the long horizon, replaced by the stink of sweat, the jolt of boots in the ribs, the drag of a chain over frozen earth. He was no longer a prophet in the eyes of his captors. He was a prize, paraded downhill like a banner torn from a defeated army. The road to the valley was lined with silence at first. Then came the stones. Villagers stepped forward to spit, to curse, to remind him of the raids, the burned houses, the bodies left behind in the snow. Some faces he recognized, not enemies, but the same poor souls he had once sworn to protect. Now their eyes held only accusation. Margherita was bound beside him, her hair tangled, her cheeks hollow, yet she carried herself with the same fierce stillness that had marked her from the beginning. If Dolcino glanced at her, she met his look without fear, as if daring the soldiers to see that their victory was incomplete. The bishop's men wasted no time. The interrogations began before the wounds from the mountain had even closed. Questions came with fists, with boots, with iron tools heated in the brazier until they glowed. They wanted names, routes, the whereabouts of hidden followers. Dolcino's answers were few, his silences many. Every pause cost him another strip of skin, another scream bitten short. But the pain was not the worst of it. The worst was the sound. Outside the cell, the muffled roar of a crowd gathering for a spectacle. Every hour it grew louder. The people were coming not to hear him preach, but to watch him break. And when the guards finally came for him again, the sun was already high, and the air smelled faintly of pitch and smoke. History remembers Dolcino as a heretic. The church remembers him as a warning. But for those who still whisper his name, he is something more complicated. Part prophet, part rebel, part man who refused to kneel, even when the fire was already at his feet. He promised paradise and instead found only ash. He led with faith and ended in chains. And yet, the more you look at his story, the harder it is to decide whether he was destroyed by the cruelty of his enemies or by the weight of his own vision. Today, the mountains he once claimed still stand. Snow still falls on the ridges where his followers starved. Villages below still ring their church bells on Sundays. But the echo of his defiance, faint as it is, has not gone completely silent. It lingers like smoke long after the flame is gone. If the world were to test you the way it tested him, would you hold to your cause until the last breath? Or would you step away before the fire found you? Thank you for watching. If you found this story worth telling, I invite you to subscribe, like, share, and leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you wish to walk deeper into the shadows of history, you can find more in the playlist Royal Blood and Tortures, the dark medieval tales. I'll see you in the next story.